All right, well, welcome everyone to the North Texas Church of Freethought, September 11th, 2022 Zoom meeting. So we do these every Sunday. We meet in person the first Sunday of the month. We'd have presentations a lot of the time, but not all the time. I've been thinking about doing this one for quite a while because I wanted to do a presentation on personhood. That's one of the subjects related to the Dobbs decision this past June, but I realized I really had to do some preliminary work first. So let's start off today with this presentation and buckle in for a lot of information, maybe I hope things that you don't already know, on the subject of what do words mean? And the subtext there you see, what do they mean to whom? Now this might seem a simple question, but it's not. In fact, it's been a recurring issue throughout the existence of this church, inasmuch as in the opinion of some, both unbelievers as well as believers, church and religion are all about and must be and can only be about deities and the supernatural. Those things are quite emphatically not what this church is about, except to the extent that we use them as object lessons in understanding human nature and examples of the trial and error, which is the only engine of human progress. Once upon a time, supernaturalism was all around everyone. It was close to, if not actually undeniable, because the sun, the moon, and the planets were gods. Every stream, every rock, every bush, and every grove of trees was sacred. And nothing that happened but for the few things that people did manage to do for themselves was free of the influence of supernatural powers. Even the regularities of nature prove nothing but the regularities of supernatural powers, just as human beings have their habits and dispositions, in addition to their unpredictable urges and fits of rage. Most that could be hoped for was to propitiate these mysterious powers with rituals, sacrifices, and, of course, most importantly, having the correct beliefs. But efforts to apply facts and reason to what everyone knew was obviously supernatural, about just what there is to see in the sky, those efforts were eventually rewarded with spectacular results. And I think we forget the impact that these kinds of things had on people in the past, especially Newton, when he came along and showed the connection between objects falling on the earth and the planets moving in the sky. To us, it's like nothing, but at that time it was a sensation. And so, it should not be dismissed as foolish to make efforts to apply facts and reason to the psychosocial, philosophical, and yes, the moral elements and implications of religion. Already, there are many forms of religion that are less ignorant, less superstitious, and less fearful and hateful than what was once all but universal. Our goal, our purpose, is to make that step, the complete elimination of supernaturalism from religion, to make that step explicit. In every other case in which supernaturalism has been abandoned, the results have surpassed all reasonable expectations. Why should we not expect that with religion? It starts with the realization that religion need not be thought of as synonymous or inseparable from supernaturalism. Church of Freethought is an effort not just to say how that might be done, rather it is an effort to show how it might be done and to actually do it. So we say that Freethought, our religion, is one that rejects faith and accepts and champions doubt. Good to question. We urge, in fact, the asking of questions and the questioning of answers, never to be content with, oh, we know it all, because we don't and we never will. And that's a feature, not a bug. Freethought is a religion that looks for its errors instead of trying to deny them, hide them, or explain them away. And also a religion that holds the value, a sacramental value of discovery and progress, not orthodoxy and dogma. We have no use for that. Among other things, we found that William James was right. Religion is a man's total reaction upon life. And we've drawn in lots of ideas from people over the years as to how this works. Please visit our Facebook page, our website, and our Twitter page. Looks like there's an additional, our Facebook website, and that's our YouTube channel. Oh my gosh, yeah. So we have a lot of stuff up there now. Please go and view these past videos, and this one too. You can put it on later if you miss anything. You probably will miss something. There's a lot to it. But to return to our subject of today, what do words mean? Now, some may think this is a silly question. After all, everyone knows that if you want to know what a word means, all you have to do is look it up in the dictionary. And it can be that simple, at least to begin with, when you come across an unfamiliar word. But often it's not so simple, especially when it comes to words that we use every day, and especially when, in the course of discussion, people may try to resolve a disagreement. I dare say we've all come up against this. They try to prove that they're right and you're wrong by citing the dictionary. That is to say, they try to prove that they are right and you are wrong by asserting that you are using a word or words incorrectly. That effectively deprives you of your means of expression, and if you can't express yourself, then you can't be right. In fact, you can't be right or wrong. You can't even have anything important to say. So unless someone is seriously mistaken or terribly unfamiliar with the English language and just actually does need some instruction, or some other language as the case may be, this is a red flag that the discussion is devolving into semantics. What are dictionaries anyway? There are many of them after all, and if one wants to think of dictionaries as holy scripture, then there's the problem of determining which of them should be considered authoritative, for they are compiled differently by different people and not, as with the Bible, the same text, although with thousands of textual variations in different translations. So again, what are dictionaries anyway? And this is not to ask what their metaphysical essence is. Rather, where do they come from? Who writes them? And how are they compiled? And if they have any kind of authority, what sort of authority is it? Your fourth grade teacher may have given the impression of being a language authority, but is there and can there even be a language authority? The earliest works that can be considered dictionaries were lists of equivalent words in different languages. One of these, consisting of Sumerian and Akkadian words in cuneiform, this is cuneiform, but it's not the item I'm talking about, just an example of cuneiform. But this list of words in two different languages was found in present-day Syria, dates to 2300 BCE. The oldest single-language dictionary appears to have been in Chinese, either a work dating to 300 BCE or maybe another dating back further to about 800 BCE. There's argument and disagreement about that. Johannes de Garlandia, or John of Garland, a 13th century grammarian who was born in England and became a university professor in Paris, wrote a Latin vocabulary entitled Dictionaries, and that is where we get the word dictionary. First dictionary in English is considered to be that of Robert Cowdrey in 1604. Samuel Johnson's 1755, A Dictionary of the English Language, is considered the first modern dictionary. And Johnson's remarkable work quickly became the established standard among English speakers and remained so for over a century. But let's take a quick tour of some entries in Johnson's celebrated work. I'm going to present some that come from an online searchable version of the 1755 edition. Endless hours of entertainment there. You can do this yourself, and you can find it at johnsondictionaryonline.com. Johnson famously defined the word oats in this way: a grain which in England is generally given to horses, but in Scotland supports the people. No, I did not make that up. So do you think this is what Johnson was told when he conducted his extensive investigations into what people of the time meant by the word oats? No, Johnson never did any such investigations, and he says this in his introduction. He also says he did not go into mines and other places of specialized endeavor and see what kind of particular terms apply to what they were doing. Do you even think, though, that this is what Johnson's contemporaries generally meant by the word oats? Clearly, Johnson relied on his own opinions in compiling his dictionary, as did all other dictionary makers of the time and generally for many years afterwards. It just shows what an intelligent, literate, well-read, and erudite English speaker can do, at least with word definitions, and if allowed, a measure of playfulness. But you see here, the difficulty is, what is grain? What does that mean? Grain, according to Johnson's dictionary, means a single seed of corn. Well, now, what is corn? He says the seeds which grow in ears, not in pods, such as are made into bread. So now we have seeds, ears, pods. You see they are down there, organized particles produced by plants and animals from which new plants and animals are generated. Ear, the spike of corn, the part which contains the seeds, and pod, the capsule of legumes, the case of seeds. So what about particle, spike, and capsule? Any small portion of a greater substance is particle. Spike is an ear of corn. Capsule is not even listed. There's no result in there. Now we begin to get a hint of a major problem with dictionaries. Words are defined with other words, and those words are then defined with yet further words that, once we look those up, refer back to many of the same words. And in this case, all the words refer to objects of objective reality. I mean, what could be simpler? We could even take pictures of such objects, and many dictionaries now include illustrations, as if to say, we're not going to define it, just look at the picture, that is what it is. How about a word that is not as objective as something like oats? How about the word liberty? Well, you see what I get there from looking up liberty, and then, since liberty is defined as freedom, looking up freedom. Oh, freedom is liberty and liberty is freedom. Independence comes into it, and that just means exemption from reliance or control, a state over which none has power, and he compares it also to slavery, and a slave is one emancipated to a master, not a free man, a dependent. I did subsequently find a quote of Samuel Johnson saying that in most societies, the very lowest levels of people have basically the freedom to work or starve. Well, how about something that is much more subjective? How about the color red? Here's what he says about red. Color of blood, one of many primitive colors, and then he gives examples of scarlet, vermilion, and crimson, and you see what those are. Does this help? Do you now know what red means? Do you now know what it is like to see the color red? Again, maybe a patch of color in the dictionary could be put in now. Might make it simpler. Keep in mind that the realization that light comes in different wavelengths did not come until the 19th century. Modern dictionaries usually define red in terms of its place on the electromagnetic spectrum, but surely science has not altered what people mean when they say something is red, has it? This doesn't change it, does it? People use the word red in the 21st century, at least outside of a spectrographic lab. Don't they mean about the same thing as they meant in Samuel Johnson's day and even before? Now we can ask, where did dictionaries come from in a different way? Who were these people, Caudry, Johnson, and others? Were they appointed to establish language standards? No. Were they interested in establishing and maintaining language standards? Without a doubt, they were. They pretty much even said so. But why, after something like 1,000 years of people speaking English or something close to it, did the first dictionaries appear when they did? How did people know what words meant before then? The answer is culture. At least what we mean by culture, and we'll get back to that word, culture. Languages are transmitted culturally by people who use the languages, so dictionaries would have had to begin as reflections of cultural practices. Now think of language in its written form. Here's a graph showing literacy, the ability to read and write over time. In the UK, English-speaking countries in practical terms, and the shorter line there in the world. Just look at how low it was to begin with, and this is starting in 1475, long after Bible times and so on. It suggests why writing was held in such high regard, revered in fact, and in many ways still is. There was a big increase in literacy, as you see there, in the 16th and 17th century. These were just the years when life was getting a little easier for many people. Thanks to Gutenberg, printed books began to be available after the middle of the 15th century, and in England, Shakespeare was writing his plays in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. The written word was not standardized, especially spelling. Did you know there are 6 known signatures of Shakespeare himself, for example? He managed to spell them all differently. And in fact, the current spelling of Shakespeare, with which we're all familiar, did not become well established until the 20th century. So the idea is that with rising literacy, there was increased interest in standards for written English, and with the availability of printed books, there was a market for reference works like dictionaries. And it's not a random coincidence that the French philosopher Diderot, here you see on the left, his famous 28-volume encyclopedia came out at about the same time over the years 1751 to 1772. Remember, Johnson's dictionary was 1755. These things, spurred on by the Industrial Revolution, drove literacy rates near to 100%. Written language became, although it was always important, even more important to more people than the spoken word. Meanwhile, think of what else was happening in the English-speaking world in the later part of the 18th and early 19th centuries. Within a few decades of Johnson's 1755 dictionary, the British colonies in America were in armed conflict with the British Crown stemming from political differences, and we all have been taught about that. And then, as now, such differences and the rise of American nationalism led to what are now called culture wars. There's that word again. Often what is at issue may seem silly, but these are the things that shape our world. Culture wars. Do we see many men today with Charlie Chaplin-style mustaches, for example? Or can you think of many products or businesses named Adolf? That name, as you can see on this tabulation from the Social Security Administration, is not a popular one, especially since 1941, beginning down there at the bottom. Yet a style of mustache and a name is not why we are filled with revulsion at what the Nazis did. Culture wars. This brings us to something you may have already noticed when we looked at Johnson's dictionary entries related to the meaning of the word red. Have you ever wondered how we came to spell words such as color and behavior without the U that people in the UK use? Or why we spell words like theater, specter, and fiber with an ER instead of an RE? Well, these and other anomalies are partly because English spelling was not well standardized in the 18th century. Like I said, Shakespeare putting his name down 6 different ways. Once the king and the colonies went their separate ways, they chose different ways of spelling. And by the way, aluminum versus aluminium is not one of those things. That just happened to do with conventions, because aluminum was not discovered until 1825 by the Englishman Humphrey Davy, and it was the International Union of Pure and Applied Chemists who established the actual correct spelling of aluminium to go with other kinds of metals that end in the neum instead of num. Look at the bottom there too. I always thought the UK draught, I thought it was pronounced draught. You just never really hear it, but it's actually draft, and the GH is like the GH in tough. So there's that. But these spelling differences are also due, in part, to this man, Noah Webster, who's best remembered for his 1806 Compendious Dictionary of the English Language, the first American dictionary. An earlier work of Webster's, the United States' first bestseller, was a 1783 spelling book. Webster also had strong political views, was an ardent supporter of the American Revolution, the U.S. Constitution, and especially Alexander Hamilton's Federalist Party. In fact, Hamilton recruited Webster as an editor of a Federalist Party newspaper. Then, as now, the news was largely opinion. Webster took the opportunity of compiling his dictionary, intended to challenge the hegemony of Johnson's work, to distinguish American English by promoting what he considered more rational spelling rules, but he only succeeded with some of them. There really was a need for an American dictionary, too, as shown by Johnson's use of the word corn that we saw earlier. Corn is what we Americans call maize, which is in Johnson's dictionary. He also refers to maize as Indian wheat. Other words familiar to Americans not in Johnson's dictionary doubtless had to do with the different circumstances of American life and the influence of other languages, including those of Native Americans, from which the word maize comes. It comes from the Arawak word for it. The words cigar, pumpkin, tomahawk, wigwam, igloo, tomato, jalapeno, and taco are not in Johnson's dictionary either. It's said that Johnson generally did not like foreign borrowings, especially from France, with which Britain was not on the best of terms at the time. That's why you don't see champagne in his dictionary. Johnson did include the words fart, piss, and turd in his dictionary, but he considered certain words to be barbarisms, such as budge, con, even gambler, too bad for you, Kenny Rogers, as well as ignoramus, shabby, trait, and volunteer used as a verb, Johnson just thought those were barbarisms. How about this? This is a word from Johnson's dictionary that could be put to good use today. It turns out that dictionaries are not as boring as many may suppose. A backfriend is a friend backwards, that is, an enemy in secret. So here's Noah Webster. I'd intended to put his photo on or drawing on the previous page, but there he is. You should know that Webster was a devout Christian and would today perhaps be a Christian nationalist. Who knows, in those days, well before Darwin, molecular biology, DNA, and the Human Genome Project, there were better reasons for believing in things that today we know are nonsense. And in fact, in those days, the Bible really was the basic text of everything. It wasn't just astronomy and geography, but anthropology. The Europeans, when they got to America, they were absolutely stunned about the Indians being there, who they called the Indians, because they're never mentioned in the Bible, and where did they come from? Well, the chief competitor of Webster's work was Johnson's dictionary, and Webster knew this. Until his death in 1843, he made sure that his dictionaries had thousands more word entries, including one that started with X. Johnson had asserted that no English word begins with X. If you're guessing xylophone, you're wrong, though. It was this, a xebec, also spelled with a Z, but apparently X-E-B-E-C is a good way of spelling it, a kind of sailing ship that was used by the Barbary pirates. You remember the Barbary pirates were bothering Americans back in the early years, and you see there a model of a xebec. So by the mid-19th century, Johnson's dictionary was showing its age. In Europe, particularly in Germany, serious study, probably outpacing that in Britain, was being devoted to philology, the study of language as found in oral and written sources. It turns out that the brothers Grimm, you see there on the left, whom you know from their collections of fairy tales, were serious scholars in this subject of philology and began work on a German dictionary in 1838. The first volume came out in 1854, but it was left unfinished at the time of their deaths in 1859 and 1863. See, lots of fun facts you're getting today. Not going to get that from any other church. So back in England, a revision of Johnson's dictionary was begun, the first volume of which was issued in 1884, and by 1928 it was 12 volumes. This is known as the Oxford English Dictionary, or the OED. This remains probably the most comprehensive and trusted work of its kind. Meanwhile, the Merriam Company had bought the rights to Webster's 1841 edition, and subsequent dictionaries became Merriam-Webster. Here's another fun fact. Webster's dictionary passed into the public domain, so now anyone can call something Webster's dictionary, and I think there was a Microsoft product which called itself Webster's. The second edition of the Merriam-Webster dictionary came out in 1934 to high praise. That's there on the left. But there was controversy when the third new international edition came out in 1961. Why? Because it undertook to describe how words were used instead of, as always had been before, prescribing how they should be used. A Publishers Weekly article in 2012 looking back at the controversy noted that pronunciations came to include a dizzying number of variations, all apparently equal in merit. Most controversial of all was the editor's policy on disputed usages. Webster's third adopted a position of scholarly neutrality on words that more conservative dictionaries rushed to label colloquial or slang or vulgar. It was a pure dictionary, all about the words, but utterly agnostic on many tricky issues dictionary users cared deeply about. You see, dictionaries were for literate people, remember, and people who appreciated culture. The very word culture, remember I brought that up earlier, that had always meant cultivated, improved, and proper. It didn't mean just generic, whatever the culture was, whether it was in jails or prisons or somewhere else. Johnson's dictionary, culture, meant the art of improvement and amelioration. His number one, that's a number two definition. The number one was actually tilling the ground, another sort of improvement to make something fit for something. Remember what Johnson had to say about barbarisms. Volunteer used as a verb. Disgusting. Just terrible. Inconceivable. Words such as ain't were beyond the pale. They were left out of dictionaries because they weren't even real words. Why, All one had to do was to consult a dictionary to see that this was true because the words weren't there. But as they always had, English speakers continued to use words as seemed best to them. They expressed themselves as they wanted, and as they heard other people express themselves. Think of how we acquire language. Yes, once you became educated, you knew that saying ain't could mark you as crude, but Webster's third didn't go to this trouble. It did not even identify which words were colloquial, correct, incorrect, proper, improper, erroneous, humorous, jocular, poetic, or contemptuous, as previous dictionaries had done. An editorial in the New York Times is quoted as saying soon after Webster's third came out, and I've not been able to track down the original sources, but this is what's on the internet. I'm saying that Webster's has it is apparent, surrendered to the permissive school that has been busily extending its beachhead in English instruction in the schools, reinforce the notion that good English is whatever is popular and can only accelerate the deterioration of the English language. How about that? Your language is it's falling apart. It's being corrupted and destroyed even every minute. Lexicographers, on the other hand, mostly considered Webster's third to be a great achievement. Professional style guides recommended it. Oh, wait, what? Lexicographers? Yes, the study of dictionaries became a serious scientific discipline in the mid-20th century. The term was around in Johnson's day. It's even cited in his dictionary. So less than 100 years ago, though, it really did become a serious science. Czech-American linguist and classicist Ladislav Zagusta, this guy here, is widely credited with founding lexicography as an authentic science. Keep in mind what you already know about science. Science is concerned with descriptions of the way the world of objective reality actually is and any regularities to that, those observations. To the extent that science is prescriptive, it is only so with respect to what it is you must do to bring about some desired, and it has to be a possible, result. As Francis Bacon famously put it, nature to be commanded must be obeyed. But the science of lexicography, like all of the social sciences, faces the challenges of having to deal with human behavior. And humans, unlike such things as electrons or atoms of a given element, they're all different, and they change over time, individually and as they go from generation to generation. One scholar notes that Zagusta, in his 1971 textbook, Manual of Lexicography, quotes authorities who have famously described dictionary making as so tedious an activity that it would make a suitable punishment for criminals. Three reasons given for the infamous difficulties are the extremely wide knowledge expected of the dictionary compiler about the phonological, grammatical, etymological, and other properties of the vocabulary to be covered, the uncertainties that surround particularly the task of explaining the meanings of words, and the tension between the potentially unlimited aim to be comprehensive and accurate on the one hand, and the unpredictable specific needs of the dictionary's eventual users on the other. Big task. Have these challenges all been solved since 1971? No, they haven't. And to add to them, there's still very much a tension between the idea that dictionaries should be guides to the meaning of words in the sense of what words actually mean, and therefore how English speakers ought to use words, and what they're allowed to mean by words, and the very different idea that dictionaries should be guides to the meaning of words in the sense of field guides to the use of language, of how English speakers actually use words and what they mean in using them. Most people are totally unaware of this distinction, but it's a very contentious issue, absolutely. In fact, so appalled by the permissiveness of Webster's third was the founder and publisher of American Heritage magazine that he tried to buy the Merriam Company in order to undo the changes. When that failed, he partnered with publisher Houghton Mifflin to produce this, the American Heritage Dictionary of 1969. This was the first dictionary to be compiled using corpus linguistics. Now, this is a method of studying language by analyzing texts, similar to the concordances that show the word counts and usage in key texts like the Bible and the Koran. But information technology made it possible to automate that process, certainly in the 1960s and thereafter. The American Heritage Dictionary, though, also relied on panels of experts to weigh in on the acceptability of words and their usage, which corrected the permissiveness in Webster's third. The trend has continued in the direction of lexicography, and therefore the dictionaries compiled by lexicographers focusing on description. And as English, unlike, for example, French, has no recognized authority on the language, there's really no one to say what proper English is anyway. There are style books for different purposes intended to establish and maintain appropriate standards in different situations, such as magazines, newspapers, and especially scientific publications. That becomes quickly apparent if you do read scientific publications. They have a particular way of presenting information. You won't find the word ain't in the Journal of the American Medical Association, at least not as an expression of the authors. But it hasn't seemed to hurt English that there is no acknowledged authority to say what is or is not a word, or how English speakers can use words to express themselves. Nor does it seem to be a problem that different standards are applied in different situations, as you see with different style books for different contexts. Just as consensus seems to work pretty well in establishing moral and legal standards, people adhere to informal standards of vocabulary and usage for the very simple reason that they wish to be understood. And to be understood is often necessary, for example, not to depart from those generally accepted standards. So while there may be nothing really wrong with using ain't or inserting a multitude of you knows or even F-bombs, I think we all know people who talk like that, not really wrong, but it's going to tend to divert attention from what the speaker intends to convey, depending on the situations. There could, of course, be other situations in which such talk is expected, and if you don't talk that way, well, maybe you'll be discovered to be an FBI plant instead of a true member of the Oath Keepers or whatever the organization is. Lewis Carroll, pen name of mathematician Charles Lutwidge Dodgson, author of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, he famously depicted in the Through the Looking Glass Humpty Dumpty, and that's a character he did not invent, by the way. It was a pre-existing character from a nursery rhyme. He depicted that character as using language in a confusing way and justifying it by saying this: when I use a word, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. Now, you can take this in the ridiculous way that the context implies, and Carroll himself wrote literary nonsense in the form of Jabberwocky in another work called The Hunting of the Snark. But it is true of all language users that they use words to mean what they intend. That's an ordinary thing. Everybody uses a word to mean just what they choose it to mean. But just because it's arbitrary in the sense that a word, we could jumble up all the words, and as Shakespeare said, a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. These are conventions that people just agree on. They tend to use words to intend the same or similar meaning, and that makes language work. But it's never as precise as when, for example, in mathematics, the word circle means a line that is at every point equidistant from a point. Here in Arlington, Texas, we have this Cowboys football team stadium, built by the taxpayers but named for the AT&T company. Many people here call it Jerry World. You see Jerry Jones there on the lower left, and many other people call it the Death Star. No dictionary will explain this, but these terms are not incomprehensible, as the first refers to Jerry Jones, as I said, the billionaire who owns Cowboys football team, and the second calls attention to the rough resemblance of the stadium to the evil galactic empire's weapon of mass destruction in the 1977 Star Wars film. And these comparisons invite interesting further connections. Now, what if I were to call this the Church of the NFL? Again, even though no dictionary would give among the meanings of church a football stadium, I think it would be understood that I was comparing the structure to a building used by followers of a religion, and that I was comparing the sport of football to a religion. What if I called it the cantaloupe of the NFL? I think that would be problematic, though the stadium has in common with the cantaloupe and the Death Star its spherical shape. What would be incomprehensible would be my calling it the brother of all guitars, though I suppose anything these days can work as clickbait on the internet. So the use of words and language come with a measure of ambiguity, innovation, and playfulness that is very situation-dependent and context-driven. And it is said that even Samuel Johnson came to terms with the difficulties, if not the impossibilities, of attempting to impose rigid standards on the use of English to tame people's use of the language. As Henry Hitchings notes in his book, Defining the World, 2006 book, it's on my list, I haven't read it yet. I found this quote, "With time, Johnson's conservatism, the desire to fix the language, gave way to a radical awareness of language's mutability. But from the outset, the impulse to standardize and straighten English out was in competition with the belief that one should chronicle what's there and not just what one would like to see." In a letter to a correspondent, and there is a wiki quote page on Samuel Johnson, he wrote in 1786, that's 31 years after the publication of his dictionary, "Dictionaries are like watches. The worst is better than none. The best cannot be expected to go quite true." So he developed skepticism about his own work. The thing to remember about dictionaries is that they are probably most useful when you don't know what a word means, because, provided you know the spelling, you can look it up to get, if not a settled and authoritative definition, as with some term in mathematics, an idea of what the speaker or writer likely intended to convey. Even then, sometimes you may need clarification. We've often seen how this is necessary, and over the years there have been many examples of pithy quotations used to make some point that was never intended by the person quoted, if you go back to the original. Marx's quote, "Religion is the opiate of the people," unquote, that's definitely one of them. Dictionaries are not useful in resolving disagreements, as we said at the outset. 20th century Austrian British philosopher Karl Popper drew attention to this in an interview, saying, "People who speak too much about words or concepts or definitions don't actually bring anything forward that makes a claim to truth. So you can't do anything against it. A definition is a pure conventional matter. They only lead to a pretentious, false precision, to the impression that one is particularly precise. But it's a sham precision. It isn't genuine clarity. For that reason, I'm against the discussion of terms and definitions. I'm rather for plain, clear speaking." And really, if two people cannot agree on what a word means, if they're fighting over what it means, they can just simply distinguish the two meanings of the same word by some means. If they're trying to be precise like mathematicians, then do what mathematicians do. Adjectives can do this, or, as in math, you can speak of A and A prime, or A1 and A2. But you cannot learn anything new about the world by defining words, and that includes mathematical terms. You can only learn about the world from description. Words are only what we use to help us describe the world. Words do not mean anything in and of themselves. Words only have the meaning intended by those who use them, just like Humpty Dumpty in Through the Looking Glass said. In the best of circumstances, those who speak or write words successfully convey to those who hear or read the words the meaning that they intended. When that doesn't happen, the results are unfortunate. As they say, a failure to communicate. In some cases, the results of that can be disastrous. Sometimes, though, they can be humorous. Closing, consider this. What is the definition of a definition? Can the word define be itself defined? Let's turn to Samuel Johnson's dictionary. Again, you can do this online for yourself, as I said. Here's his definition of the word definition, a short description of a thing by its properties. And then if you turn to description, he says, a lax definition. Although Johnson was a lexicographer, he was clearly not a scientific lexicographer. He was born 200 years too early for that. His entry for science leaves a little something to be desired as well. Here's all the definitions he gives for science. Knowledge, certainty grounded on demonstration. I think we would take issue with that. Art attained by precepts or built on principles. Well, they did consider mathematics a science, and it is, I suppose, but not like astronomy or physics or anything else. Any art or species of knowledge, and then he says one of the seven liberal arts: grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, music, geometry, and astronomy. Pretty limited back then. So thank you very much and good morning. I hope that's given you a lot to chew on, to think about, and I hope that we'll have some lively discussion that will not be part of the presentation we'll put up on YouTube, of course. You'll have to join us for that. Elias Facet, our Latin motto, which means do better. Reminder of our principles of reason, enjoyment, appreciation, and love, and how those relate to other words, all of which we could look up in a dictionary. Maybe we'll do that. Go to our website, churchoffreethought.org, to sign up and get the weekly e-newsletter at the bottom of every page, and then you can come and join us on the Zoom presentations when they're given live. Or if they're just discussions, you can hear what real freethinkers, real atheists, unbelievers, rationalists think about the world and things going on. Visit us on Facebook and Twitter. As I said earlier, we do also depend on your continued support, financial as well as participation. Donate also on our website. There are little buttons you can push to donate easily by PayPal, or there's an address you can send checks to if you want to do that. Support your values by supporting the NTCOF. We can do together what none of us can do on our own. And I'm going to have to think of a new jokey thing to put at the bottom now as far as a discount, so you don't have to tie the full 10% like traditional churches. But do join us in promoting facts and reason and celebrating doubt. Take these ideas out into the community and share them with your friends. Don't be bamboozled by all the silly things that people believe, and not just God's. Demonstrate your commitment and be the future that you wish to see. With that, we'll go to question and answer discussion. I'm really very interested in what all of you have to say about what we've just been talking about. Thanks again.